Guess who's back? Guess who's back? Guess who's back? Yes. Please tell me you know who sings that. If you do, kudos. Thank you. You're welcome. Today's book is A Memory of Violets by Hazel Gaynor. I have mixed feelings about this novel. One is the narration. The narrator, when she was actually narrating characters, not half bad. Although I could not figure out what one of the main characters, Tilly, I couldn't figure out what her accent was. She sounded Irish, but I think she was actually just English. She was just from the north. If you've ever watched Doctor Who, the way that Tilly sounded did not sound like what the people from the north sound like. Whatever. Overall, when she was narrating, it was very delicate, very gentle, and it lacked power. It lacked conviction, which made Tilly in particular come off as weak. And that bothered me because there were two storylines. I thought Tilly's storyline was the weaker of the two. And then for Tilly herself to come off as weak, it made me not want to continue with the novel. Unfortunately for me, Tilly's storyline was the majority of the novel. So what I ended up doing was I sped it up, and that helped. One, because I didn't have to sit through it for as long, but two, it gave the narration a little bit more punch. So yeah, I should have done it sooner, but I was trying to be good and listen to a book at the rate that it was supposed to. But no. Lesson learned, if I don't like the narration, let's just speed it up. We open the novel, and as I said, we have two storylines. One is Florrie. Florrie has a little sister named Rosie, and they are flower sellers in London in the late 1800s. Tilly then comes in the early 1900s to work at this home for flower girls. So flower girls were on the street. They were destitute. They needed care. They tended to be orphans, whatever it was. This is based off of true events, but then Gaynor fictionalized them. So in her novel, the benefactor is this guy named Albert Shaw, and he established Shaw's home for watercress and flower sellers, or flower girls. Tilly ends up to be an assistant housemaid for him. But outside of opening up and learning a little bit about Florrie and her home life, we then jump into Tilly, who is on the train from the north to London, and she meets this kind, elderly woman who asks her, is this the beginning of your journey or the end of your journey? Because generally when I meet people, they're on one track or the other. This woman then brings out this handkerchief that becomes important later on. They part ways. What we also know about Tilly is not only is she leaving her home and she's leaving her family, but she's leaving a secret. Something is going on back home. If we could have gotten to that sooner, this novel would have been stronger. I get it. There was some drama back home. You don't get along with your family, your dad's out of the picture, and your dad's the only one who cared for you. But we repeated the same thing over and over and over instead of moving forward in the mystery of her home life. By the end, when the big reveal happened, I loved it, but it was too late, because by this point, we were not going to have time to explore it. And that was the one thing that made Tilly interesting. We do learn, no, do I get into that yet? No. Yeah, Tilly she's running from something. And she's going to be the assistant house mother at one of these homes for Watercress and Flower Girls, only to get there and the actual house mother has broken her leg and gone off to the country to heal. So she's the interim house mother. When she gets there, she's brought to her room, and there's something about this room that's not quite right. It's a little bit cold, a little bit eerie, but she discovers a box. And in the box is a journal, and this turns out to be Florrie's journal. It's really about how Florrie got separated from Rosie, and she spent the rest of her life determined to find Rosie. For me, so even if you read The Dust Jacket, everything tells you that she died from a broken heart. She never found Rosie and she died from a broken heart. I might have missed it, but Gaynor never actually tells us how or when or why Florrie died. All we know is by the time that Tilly comes around, Florrie is gone. If the whole point is that Florrie is determined to find her sister, that she keeps this journal in which she's writing to her sister, I would have thought we would have spent the majority of Florrie's storyline seeing her looking for her sister, which we do not. I will say, as I mentioned before, Tilly was the weaker storyline, so I did enjoy all these excerpts from Florrie's journal, but there wasn't enough. And I loved the insights into her world, but I found myself wondering, what's the point? Because I thought we were going to be going along Florrie's journey as she misses her sister, looks for her sister, suffers from the absence of her sister. Like, how did she die of a broken heart? How did this impact her? Because by the time that we finish her journal, it's 20 years later, and we've only gotten like 5 excerpts. I mean, that's probably an underestimation, but we don't get a look into what she did. So everything else that we're learning is from other casting characters 30 years after Florrie's journal. Immediately, Tilly meets Albert Shaw, who has also brought along his 2 nephews, Herbert and Edward. Herbert's the attractive one. Edward is the awkward one. Obviously, Tilly automatically falls for Herbert. And I thought the romance stuff was useless. Part of Tilly's problem is that she didn't feel loved. She didn't feel valued. So I get it. Romance is something that makes us feel valued, and it gives us some worth. So on that note, absolutely. But it's so one note that I don't understand why we had to have it there. And what then ends up happening happens so fast that it didn't do anything for me as the reader to be then rooting for Tilly, and so glad that she has this to help her accept herself and to help her heal over the traumas from her past. But from Florrie's journal, we see that they were Irish. Things were going badly in Ireland, so her parents come over to England, and apparently the dad got money by ill-gotten means. We don't really know. It just sets him up as being a ne'er-do-well. Not a good dad, abusive, dishonest, all that kind of stuff. But, you know, mother loved her kids. Then she died of cholera. Rosie was nearly blind. Florrie was crippled. And that's the thing about the homes for the Watercress and Flower Girls, is it took in not necessarily orphaned girls, but it took in the disabled. It took in all the girls that otherwise wouldn't have been able to get through life. But Florrie is always telling Rosie, do not let go of my hand. And then one day, I think she gets knocked to the ground and Rosie is taken from her. And it is the lemonade seller who, not a good dude. By this point, I believe the father has died too. So once the mother died, they realized they are not gonna stay with their dad, so they were living on the streets anyways. This lemonade seller took it upon himself to get an idea into his head. So he kidnaps Rosie. Rosie is able to get away, but because she's nearly blind, she runs through the streets and she doesn't know where she ends up, but she finds a carriage and she hides underneath the carriage. So we've gone from Florrie's point of view to Rosie's. So Rosie is like 4 or something, I think, maybe 6. She rides all the way into the countryside, and when she's discovered, and this is something that I don't understand just because I don't understand the sign of the times, but everybody is so accusatory and hating her because they think that she's up to no good. I'm like, she's a blind 6-year-old who obviously needs a good meal and a hot bath. Why are we being so terrible towards her? Thankfully, the woman who owned the carriage, her name is Marguerite Ingram, she had suffered the loss of her own daughter due to scarlet fever. She was grieving. It had been 3 years, but she was still grieving, and the arrival of Rosie filled the hole that she needed filled. They end up taking Rosie in. They're very wealthy. Marguerite's husband works in sugar and factories and things like that, and everything he touches turns to gold. She decides, I'm gonna keep this kid. Why they needed to keep it a secret, I don't know. Again, it's a sign of the times that I don't understand. So they pass her off as a relative and then realize, because they decide to move, well, once we move, like, we can just claim her as our own. This is something that I don't quite understand. Again, it's a sign of the times, but Marguerite is under the impression that they can actually get Rosie's eyesight fixed. Her first impression is that it was just an infection, but then the doctor tells her, oh, well, this is something that she was born with. She's completely blind in one eye and almost completely blind in the other eye. This is 1876. Right now it's 2024. Nobody is coming near my eyeball with a scalpel, but nobody's going anywhere near my eyeballs in the 1876 medical profession. And to spoil things, we do find Rosie in present in the 1912s in Tilly's timeline, and her eyesight has been completely restored. She's like near perfect vision. I would have loved for Gaynor to have gone into that, because I had a hard time believing that was achievable, but we needed her to have perfect vision, so we didn't know it was her when we first met her. So maybe that's just Gaynor's creative license. Before they leave, Marguerite decides that she needs to go to London to try to find Florrie. Rosie doesn't say much, so they end up calling her Violette because Marguerite is French. Rosie had been found with a bunch of violets. Sorry, there's something scratching me. But Rosie has a sister, and so Marguerite, in my opinion, half-heartedly goes to London because she doesn't know the full extent behind Rosie's past. So she has no idea if somebody's actually going to come looking for her, but there's a sister, so if anything, she's going to find this sister. She goes to the slums, encounters this little flower girl who's like, oh yeah, I know a girl named Florrie who had a blind sister named Rosie. And so she gives all this information that verifies Rosie's identity, but also provides information that Marguerite did not have before. She then goes to where the girls supposedly lived, but the dad had died, the aunt had gone crazy, the cousin had run off with a man, so they're not able to find her, but they do run into Albert Shaw, who helps them get out of the maze. And there are all these really close brushes with Florrie that I both loved and hated. I loved that we, the reader, are like, oh my gosh, the answer's right there. But then I hated that Gaynor, because we didn't explore anything with Florrie, it's like Gaynor just dropped it and left us wanting more in the worst kind of ways. Rosie and Florrie never meet again. Rosie has this great life. Florrie's life is not so bad either because she is taken care of. But the thing about these flower girl homes is there are orphanages, Clacton-on-Sea. There's kind of two places for these girls to live. Either Clacton-on-Sea when they're younger, up until the age of 14, at which point they're moved to London and they start working, making flowers, because that's what the flower girls did, is they would make flowers out of silk. Rosie, she ends up going to Clacton-on-Sea to live in the orphanages there, but then at some point she's like, you know what, I have too much passion for what we are doing at my certain age than just go and work for somebody, because they're taught life skills, they're taught how to be kind of maids. She's like, I would rather stay with this organization which is when she does go to London and she stays at one of these homes. We just lose track of her from there. I couldn't tell you what happens. She eventually dies. She does have a best friend named Lily Brannon. I think that was her last name. I could not get a physical copy of this book just to do some fact checking, so please forgive me. We do have kind of a big deal made out of the fact that she had this best friend, and this best friend went to the countryside because she did have an aunt. So her parents had both died when she was young. The aunt, for some reason, instead of taking her on, put her with the Flower Girls. So when the aunt takes ill, Lily leaves and she goes to take care of the aunt and gets married and never comes back. Now we're just going to go back to Tilly because there's nothing yet to tell you about with Florrie. But Tilly living her best life. The girls are all enlisted to make 1 million flowers for Alexandria Day. Actually, first, I want to go back to the whole Marguerite thing, trying to find Florrie. I found it very unsatisfying. One, Marguerite was scared out of her mind. I don't understand why she was scared out of her mind. I understand being scared that the girl's gonna be taken away from her, and maybe because I can't connect emotionally to that situation, it didn't hit me the way it needed to. But I found Marguerite to be selfish in all of her intentions and all of her actions. So this whole thing fell flat for me. It didn't feel like she tried very hard to find Florrie. I found myself frustrated, angry, ambivalent regarding this whole thing, because if you found Rosie in this condition, imagine what condition Florrie is in. So why are we not wanting to find Florrie so at least the girls can be reunited and be together in this wonderful home you're going to provide? And I understand why she would be selfish. She lost a child and now she has a replacement child. She wants to be able to keep this replacement child. But she could have done good for somebody else as well. In my opinion, she didn't try very hard to make that happen. And then whenever she would hear Rosie talking about Florrie, because Florrie sort of became her imaginary friend, she would get so mad. Like, who's at fault for that? Florrie was Rosie's everything. And now that she's your Violette, she's not allowed to have that as part of her life anymore? Because you didn't put enough effort in? Although it did make me so grateful for Google, because as she's trying to navigate these streets, I'm just like, oh, how hard is it? But it is hard when you don't have a roadmap, you don't know anybody, nobody's going to talk to you because they think you're just some silly rich person trying to do whatever you're trying to do. So I did feel bad for her in some respects, but overall, this let's go find Florrie thing was deeply unsatisfying. However, I forgot where I was, so we're going to go somewhere else. As I mentioned, Tilly has an infatuation for Herbert, which I don't understand. I thought we could have done so much more with it. We all are under the understanding that Herbert is going to be a jerk. He just is. And Edward is the one who is going to be kind and worth her time. Yet, it's very flat, very one note. She cannot see the forest through the trees with Herbert. And then there's just Edward. Like, like, the thing is, these guys are included because Albert Shaw did not have any of his own sons. So these guys needed to be in the picture because they were going to take over for him, upon his death or whenever. And he is sick. I forgot to look up what it's called, but basically the London air was not good for him. It created health issues for him. So I understand why the guys are there, but I wish we had delved further into that if we're going to talk about it at all. It's one thing for Tilly to be attracted to Herbert. It's a whole other thing for her to get all offended about the way he talks to her or about her or whatever when he's not a player in her life. It kind of reminds me of the Tea Rose, the series where the boyfriend, fiance, husband, who he only wanted the main character for her money. So I was like, if Herbert had been using her for some reason and then tossed her aside, I'd be okay with it. But he was a non-entity. So that was just a fail for me. Eventually, Tilly realizes this guy's a jerkbag. And it happens because she's invited to an event, including all of the Shaw family members. He essentially forces her to reveal her family drama. I don't understand why she felt the need to say what she had to say. He was talking about her family, and she didn't like what, I don't know, I kind of tuned out. He was saying something, and she felt like she needed to defend herself. So she just blurts out, well, my sister's a cripple, and it wasn't my fault. And she's so embarrassed by this. This is when she has to leave town and go to the countryside for a little while, which is where she starts to connect with Edward. But I don't understand why she felt the need to defend herself, because from what I heard, yeah, he was being a jerk, but it wasn't anything that required that kind of response. But, and now that we're on the matter of her family, her sister's name is Esther. She has a very tumultuous relationship with Esther, because Esther, in terms of their mother, was the favorite. We get the impression that things had been fine with the mother until Esther was born, and in Tilly's own words, she had loved Esther once. So she had loved Esther when Esther was first born. But then over the succeeding weeks, she realized that her mother wanted nothing to do with her, and it was all about Esther, which caused her to harden her heart, as they would say, and hatred towards Esther. I don't mind this. I really enjoyed finally getting to understand what happened at home, but I thought we could have done it sooner, and we could have done it faster, so that when we got to things at the end, we could have looked into it a little bit more. The end was far too rushed for me. It seems, so Tilly was threatened by Esther in many ways, not only because her mother loved Esther and wanted nothing to do with Tilly, but Esther was beautiful. Esther was the child that her parents had been trying to have, yet failed so many times to do so. One day, she and Esther go riding. She's a very strong horsewoman. Esther is not. All she wanted to do was cause Esther to get a little dirty, make Esther cry, basically be a bully of a big sister. A train comes along, and she challenges Esther to outrun this train. Well, Esther's horse gets spooked, and Esther gets tangled up in the horse. Horse falls on her, breaks her spine. Now she is paralyzed. Tilly, naturally, feels extremely guilty about this. I'm okay with that, but I needed more. I felt like, because at the same time, Tilly still hates Esther, because then Esther was allowed to wallow in her self-pity. Everybody just let Esther go along being the favorite, being the perfect child. So I don't, it was one-dimensional in many ways. And by this time, their father has died. He had gone off to fight in a war. We get this thing about his brown felt cap that he had worn as part of his uniform, and when he had died, they'd sent that back along with some handwritten letters, which I was kind of confused about. And I guess soldiers would write letters that would be delivered upon their death. But she never got to read her letter, and she'd kind of forgotten about it until at a certain point in this novel. Oh my gosh, the number of times that it was repeated, brown felt hat, letters. I was like, stop. The number of times that you reminded me about this brown felt hat and these letters, we could have gotten something far more meaty in there that would have improved the novel. I get the repetition. I understand why we are repeating ourselves, but it was unnecessary. While Tilly is at Clacton-on-the-Sea, she re-encounters Marguerite, and this is also when she meets Marguerite's daughter, Violette Ashton, because she's gotten married. When she first saw the handkerchief, because I don't remember if I mentioned this, in Florrie's box alongside the journal, there were a couple other items, one of which was a handkerchief. and on this handkerchief were some shamrocks, which had been, when they had come over from Ireland, her grandmother had sewn 2 handkerchiefs, both the exact same, one for Rosie, one for Florrie. The handkerchief that Tilly had noticed Marguerite with on the train was the same as this handkerchief that she'd found in the box. And she was like, oh my gosh, like, that looks just like the handkerchief that I've seen. And so now that she's meeting Ashton, she's like, I know that handkerchief. So she starts to wonder about this whole thing because she's now on a mission to find Rosie. She's like, I'm gonna ask Violette if she knows anything about this. Writes her a letter, and then she gives it to her. And then she gets a note saying, your mom is sick, you need to come home. So she comes home to find that her mother just passed. And what, I could care less about Esther. I think she is such a nasty piece of work at this point. We don't know how she feels about Tilly. But the first thing she says is, because Tilly goes, she couldn't have waited for me. Esther goes, well, she waited long enough. I'm like, how long did she wait? Tilly didn't get the letter till after she came back from Clacton-on-Sea. So how long was that telegram or letter waiting for her to read? So anyways, both Esther and the mother are nasty pieces of work. Literally, because Esther said that she heard the train whistle and that's when she died. Like, she knew that you were here when she heard the train whistle. And I was like, what a thing to say to your sister. So they have their thing, and it is when Tilly is on her way back home that she remembers the letters from her father. And for me, I'm like, how could you forget about them? If he was so important to you, how could you not be thinking about these letters? How can you not know where they are? But she didn't. While she's at home, she is actually visited by Edward and one of the girls from the flower home. While they're there, the girl named Hilda has quite an impression on Esther, which leads to Esther wanting to come back to London with her, especially since she's crippled. She's like, I will be a perfect fit at these homes. They're kind of repairing their relationship when Tilly gets a package. And it's from a neighbor back home, and the neighbor's like, so I found these things, I didn't know what to do with them, so I thought I'd pass them on. It's the brown felt hat and the letters. And what do you think Tilly's letter says? Like, this one absolutely knocked me off my feet, which is why I was so upset that it was so far into the novel, because it opened up so many doors. And Tilly was weak and boring and simpering to me. And if we had introduced this sooner, it would have been a game changer. I do need to mention that we had one mention of her being Irish because she has bright red hair. She's like, no, totally not Irish, 100% English. And then somebody else, when they see her and Esther, they're like, you're sisters? You don't look like sisters. She's like, yes, we're sisters. This gives you any inclination as to where I'm headed. Only 2 mentions in the entire novel. She finally reads the letter that her dad wrote. He apologizes for leaving, even though, nothing was going to change his mind. But he also tells her, hey, your mom is not who you think she is. Hannah, that's not your mother. Hannah is Esther's mother. Your mother is this girl named Lily Brannon. She came home to take care of her aunt. We fell in love. We got married. She died in childbirth. So Lily, who all of her friends at the flower house thought had forgotten about them, no, she didn't forget about them. She died in childbirth. And so now we have a connection back to Florrie, which I'm loving. I love when things come full circle. I love when there are connections. He's like, please forgive your sister. Please learn how to get along with your sister. Please forgive your mother. It's not her fault. She really tried to love you, but when it came to actually having her own child, there was nothing that could compare to it, which I thought was a 100% complete cop-out. Tilly is floored. Is she upset? No. which I felt like there should have been a little bit of anger there because she'd been lied to her entire life. No wonder she didn't feel loved by this woman, because this woman didn't love her. You know how much grace could have been given if she had known the truth? There is a picture enclosed, and she's like, oh my gosh, I look just like my mother. There is a woman named Queenie who is at the flower home who knew Florrie and Lily, so she's able to learn things about her mother from Queenie. So she's finding her healing in that sense. By some stretch of the imagination, she and Esther are coming to terms with things. She admits that there are some walls that she's just not able to break, but on the whole, thumbs up. She's visited by Violette. Actually, she gets a letter from Violette, and Violette's like, I'm so sorry to hear this story. I don't know who this girl is, though, because she doesn't really give specifics to Violette in her initial letter. She's just like, here's this story about these two sisters. I'm trying to find this sister. Violette is like, you know, there are some similarities. Like, you know, my sister died when I was young. I did have vision problems when I was young, but I don't know anything else. So I forget where the leap was made, but at some point Violette/Rosie is like, you know what? I'm gonna go back to talk to Tilly. So she visits her, and I think around this, she already, you know what? They had another conversation. There was a conversation in which Tilly actually says Florrie's name. And Violette's like, what? Who? I had an imaginary friend named Florrie. Memories start to come back to her, and she's like, I'm Rosie. So she visits Tilly. Sorry, I cannot remember timeline of events. Whatever it is, Violette visits Tilly in the room. And they're having a chat. I think she does have the book by now, because I think it was this encounter. Could have been whatever the case. She's like, I'm totally Rosie. I think the biggest disappointment I had in this novel is there's sort of like a gothic aspect to it, because Florrie/Tilly's room is haunted by Florrie, but not only is it haunted by Florrie, it's also haunted by Tilly's parents. And this is where I thought it got a little strange, because we get Florrie's perspective watching Tilly in bed, watched over by a brunette woman and a man. This whole gothic tone here where the room is haunted, I thought we could have done so much more with. Otherwise, why is it there? Like, it was such an afterthought. Now Rosie's in the room, and she's like, Tilly, I'm here, I've been found. And there's like a sigh and a sigh and like an acceptance, almost as if Florrie is able to move on. Rosie/Violette then has a confrontation with her own mother. It went how it went. They end up coming to terms with things too, but we are in the last fourth of the novel. So not only are we dealing with Tilly's family drama, but we are now dealing with Violette's family drama. That would have taken up half the novel on its own. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how are we going to fit all of this in here, because this is traumatizing for both women. So how are we going to naturally and completely get their healing into this novel in the last fourth of the novel, when there's also all of these other elements of the novel to tie up? Whatever the case, Tilly and Edward go back to Clacton-on-Sea. They're sent with a wreath made with, you know, these silk flowers, and Edward reveals to her this monument for the first girl who ever died on the property, and I'm like, where is this coming from? Are we getting more ghosts in here? Is this supposed to be Florrie? Like, how are we connecting it? Yeah, it's kind of out of left field. But they're talking. She says, do you think your uncle knows? And Albert is not doing well by this point. And she's like, do you think your uncle will ever understand the impact he's had on these people's lives? He's like, I don't think we'll ever quite understand what it's like to have lived that kind of a life and then to be saved from it. Then he says, I mean, you realize that my uncle is dying. He's not coming back from this. She's like, yeah. They have a moment where he essentially proposes to her, and they're making out on the beach, only for someone else to be like, hey, you need to come quick. Albert has died. That is the end of the novel. It's not the end. What then happens, like the next chapter, is Tilly, and I'm like, how old is she at this point? Because particularly the way it's narrated, you'd think she was 13. But she has come to terms with her father's death. He's not coming back. She can't hold on to him anymore. She and Edward have married. It's only like 6 months later, which I guess in those times things moved quicker. But she has written her father one last letter. She has included her sketches, all the things that she had saved for him, and sets it adrift. The very end of the novel is that, and this, I don't know. So it's an epilogue. Violet is dying. Rosie is waiting to welcome her. Like, here is my hand. Let's not let go. I did the math. If Rosie was, because she's in her 30s in 1912. So this epilogue takes place in 1932. So if we're going to do a little bit of math here, she's only in her mid-50s when she dies, but she's full gray haired. Like, we don't know why she dies. Seems like it's old age, if the whole gray hair thing has anything to do with it, but I was like, I mean, I know people had a different lifespan 100 years ago, but she might be like 55, 56. It's not that old. But then again, I don't know. It could just be a different time, and she was that old, but I was thinking she was like 80. And she's only in her mid-50s. So I had quite a few, like, it wasn't a bad book. The writing was actually quite good. Overall, characterization was nice. I loved this insight into the Flower Girls of London, but when it came to the storylines and the main characters, there's a lot left to be desired. If you have any historical novels, anything that involves ghosts, I'm here for it. Hope you enjoyed this. Love to hear from you. Like, subscribe, comment, and we'll have another review next week. Bye!